he talks about my house, he's talking about, back then he's talking about the temple, but now the temple is here. We are the temple of God. So now I want you to think when he says, build my house, he's talking about us. Build the temple of the Holy Spirit. Does anyone want to read it? Can anyone see it? Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat but do not have enough. You drink but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put into a bag with holes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways, go up to the mountains and bring wood and build a temple, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, but indeed it came to little. And when you bought it home, I blew it away. Why, says the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that is in ruins, while every one of you runs in his own house.
Wow. Thank you. So 4 main points about this story. Number 1, I just told you the background to this book, that 50,000 left Babylon to Judah to return home. Clearly, it's safe to say that they were committed believers, right? Because they were given the option to leave Babylon. They grew up in Babylon. They probably had jobs in Babylon. Babylon was their adopted home. But they believed so much in the promised land, and they believed so much that God had much more to do with them, that they left their adopted home and they went to Judah. Okay, so number 1 is these people that God's talking to, they're committed believers. I want us to think, does that sound like us at all? At one point, God willing, we still are, but at one point we were fully committed Christians, right? You prayed every day, you read your Bible every day. God willing, this is still the case. But at one point, for many of us, this was the case. Something may have happened. Maybe we got into a fight with a friend at church. Maybe we didn't do well on exam. Maybe we prayed for, something to be removed from our lives and God didn't do it. And at some point, the relationship stalled. Did we ever reignite the relationship? Or did we, like the people in this story, did we let it sit for 14 years? Okay? Also, when we wait, right, when it's 14 years of us waiting to rebuild our relationship with Christ, sometimes our conscience nags at us. Okay? And then when our conscience begins to nag at us, when you hear that voice in your head that says you should go back to reading, you should go back to praying, you should go back to church, we start making excuses. Oh, I'm so busy. Oh, I can't do this. I have a million things going on right now. That leads to point number 2. Okay, so point number 1 is committed believers. Point number 2 is they're making excuses. We have excuses. In the beginning of the book of Haggai, I didn't put it up here, but in the beginning of the book of Haggai, the people, the Jews say, this is what they say. They say, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. So they're saying, hold up, time out. We don't have time for this right now. They're making excuses. We don't have time. We're busy. We got school, we got family, we got a job, we have finals, we have X, Y, and Z. We'll eventually get around to Christ. Eventually, right? Eventually. That's point number 2. Point number 3. We are blind to God's hand. Okay? The people in this story, are they having problems? Clearly, they're having problems. They eat, but they're not full. They drink, but they're still thirsty. They work for their money. They put it in their pockets, and they put it in their bags. And the bag has holes. Clearly, they have problems. Clearly, okay. They sow. In the very first line, they sow and they bring in little. Now, imagine if you sow much. Just to take ourselves back to this mind for a minute. Imagine they sow the first harvest, and nothing really happens. They get a little bit, so they throw double. Okay, they're like, oh, we're going to double down. If I throw double, maybe I'll get some back. They get nothing back, right? And the following year, there are even more problems because they have less to throw. They have less seeds to throw. Does that make sense? So there's serious problems here. Also, during this time, inflation was out of control. Side note, okay? But they were missing something really important, that God was the cause of these problems. It sounds weird to say. But he was trying to wake them up by causing these issues in their lives. They didn't see that, okay? They thought that they could work harder, they could work faster, and make up for all their problems. They thought that it was in their hands to fix it. So not only did they miss the point entirely that God was causing these problems so that they would return to him, but it almost created more sin for them because they were already busy as it is ignoring God's kingdom, God's temple. And when all these problems came, they said, wow, we have to work harder, we have to work faster. And so they created even more of the sin. They kept themselves busy. And point number 4, so point number 1 was they're believers. Point number 2 is we make excuses. Point number 3 is we're blind to God's hand. And point number 4 about the story is they will never be satisfied. Clearly, they're miserable. Imagine if you go to work every single day and bi-weekly you expect to get a paycheck, and when the paycheck comes to your home, you're supposed to get paid $500 every 2 weeks, and you open your paycheck and it's $30. You're going to go, I just worked 2 weeks expecting to make $500. It's going to make you miserable after time. They're miserable, okay? They're also exhausted. Remember these points that I told you about, the consequences of busyness, misery, exhaustion, the covering of sins and feelings. So they're miserable, they're exhausted, and they will never be happy because they are pursuing things that are temporary. A nice sentence, when I was reading some commentary about the story, there was a nice sentence that said, they put the creation before the creator. So I wanted to share that with you. Any comments or questions on the story for Guy? Okay, the next story I want to take a look at is the story of Martha and Mary. You can't talk about busyness without talking about this story, so please bear with me. I want to take a deep dive into some points. Hopefully it works. Sorry. I think there's the battery. Yeah, okay. Maybe now. Thank you. So I want to take a deep dive into Martha and Mary, okay? We don't have to read it because I think everybody knows the story for the most part, but I want to call out some verses. I want to talk about Martha first, okay? Actually, I do want to read it. I'm sorry, I changed my mind. I want to read it. Does anyone want to read it? Anybody? It's an easy one. Yeah, sure. Yeah, as long as you use NKJ. Is it New King James?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her.
Thank you. So Martha, what is the first sentence she says in the story? She says, not that. She says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Martha is talking to Christ. She says, Lord, don't you care? Now imagine her tone. She's not saying, Lord, don't you care? She's being stern. Seriously, she's talking to Christ, God incarnate, saying this. Lord, do you not care? Do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. She's rebuking Christ. Clearly, if you haven't gotten already the point, she's anxious, she's angry, and she's frustrated. Again, one of the consequences of being busy, right? Christ is compassionate in his response, but he doesn't compliment her. He doesn't say, you have a noble heart, you have a servant's heart, thank you for all the work that you did. He doesn't say that, okay? He's compassionate but not complimentary. He says, but one thing is needed. But one thing is needed. By the way, just a side story. On Sunday, Emba David was at my church in Long Island, and he was giving a lecture, and he said that whenever Christ goes to, I don't want to use the word criticize, but edify someone, he always says, but one thing is needed. One thing you lack, right? One thing is needed. What is the one thing that's needed here in the story, right? It's an obvious Sunday school answer, but it's the truth, right? Christ is the only thing that's needed, not just in the story, but in our lives. When we say that, it's really hard to say, okay, great, Christ is the only thing I need, and I don't need school, work, family, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's not what that means at all. It means that Christ is the most important thing. One thing is truly needed. Okay? The second sentence he says is, and Mary has chosen that good part. Now, in some translations, that actually reads, Mary has chosen the good portion. And when you think of that, when you read it, you're like, good portion. That sounds like you're talking about food, right? A good portion. I want to make a point here. There's a lot of things that we can choose to, not physically, but metaphorically. There are a lot of things we can choose to feed ourselves. There's a lot of things that we can choose to ingest and put in our stomach that will give us a feeling of satisfaction and fullness, but it won't last. So here, Christ is saying only one thing satisfies truly and deeply the stomach, the hunger that's in our lives. It's the words, the body, and the blood of Christ Jesus, right? That's it. Job, by the way, in Job 23, he said, I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food. So this is not an uncommon idea that his words are to be eaten. King David also talks of this in the Psalms. The last point that Christ says is, which will not be taken away from her. So what was the real difference between Martha and Mary? Like really, does anyone want to take a stab at it? What is the real difference between Martha and Mary?
What they are busy with.
Okay. Yes. That's at first glance, we'll say yes.
Martha is constantly working to do Christ-like services, while Mary is taking the time to actually admire and sort of see the qualities in Christ.
Okay, that's also true. But I'm talking about deep down inside the intent of the heart.
Maybe Martha's looking to impress. I don't know what Mary's doing.
Martha is looking to
Impress.
impress. Yes.
I don't know what Mary's up to.
Yeah. Well, Mary. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to put it this way. Martha is looking for her own glory. Martha is looking for her own glory. It's the idea of if she prepared enough, she can impress. Ooh, look at the spread. You know. Wow, that turkey looks amazing. For example, right? She's trying to impress her own glory. Mary is not. She is only searching for the glory of Christ. She's only bringing glory to Christ, right? She's sitting at his feet to listen. That's really important, okay? Why? Why is it really important? And it goes back to what Christ is saying. If we pursue our things for our own glory, they're temporary and they're fleeting. They'll quickly vanish. And in frustration, right? As Martha shows when she says, what are you doing? Why don't you talk to Mary? But if we pursue things for the glory of Christ, they will never be taken away. So that's really important to ask ourselves, why am I doing this thing? Am I doing it for me, or am I doing it for the glory of Christ? Okay, my last point. Some tools to help you fight busyness, if I haven't sold you enough on why busyness is bad. Any questions, by the way? Any questions? Okay. So how do we fight busyness? How do we make ourselves less busy? Number one, it's an obvious one. It's to track your time. Literally, if you want to write it in your phone, or if you want to carry around a little notebook, if you're the paper and pen type of person, literally write down, I just spent 45 minutes doing XYZ. I just spent 2 hours doing XYZ. You'll notice that after maybe just give it a week, or maybe maximum 2 weeks, you give it a week, you'll notice, wow, I spent hours doing X, Y, and Z. And you'll be amazed, right? And also please track how much time you spend on your phone. I need to do that, right? Because you can be busy on your phone also. Number two, you can simplify and eliminate the excess in your life by using this grid. How many of you seen this? Some of you?
We just spoke about it last Sunday.
Did you
And the
really?
Sunday before.
Really? Okay, sorry. So I didn't know. Anyway, so this is, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's two axes, right? It's a grid. So on the left axis, this one, the y-axis, put the y-axis, you have important, and then you have not important. And over here on the x-axis, you have urgent and not urgent. Okay, so I don't want to dwell too much on it. I didn't know that you already heard it. But you want to spend most of your time on things that are important but not urgent. You want to focus your time there. Okay, important and not urgent. This is actually the box where your Bible reading, where your prayer, where your church is. This is the box that many of the important things dwell. It's important but not urgent. You want to manage urgent and important because you don't want those things to get in the way. This is where we can easily busy ourselves with the urgent and important. We want to avoid the urgent but not important. You know, the stuff that's like really, really pressing, but totally not important. Then that's something you totally want to avoid doing that. And lastly, the not urgent and the not important, try to cut it out completely. So it's easy to try and compartmentalize everything you do in your life in one of these 4 boxes. My job, I would put it as not urgent but important. My school, I would put it as, urgent and important maybe. For some people, for some others, it's not urgent but important. Some others, not urgent, not important. So pick and choose where your activities fall into these categories.
Just pick and choose right.
Pick and choose right.
I mean,
Right.
because I think we can put things not in the right place.
It's a very good point. Yeah.
It depends on your treasure. Where your treasure is, where you prioritize.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually my next point. Know your priorities and observe them. So without knowing your priorities, like Uncle Samir said, you're not going to be able to categorize those things in those 4 boxes. You have to know your priorities. And the next slide I have to credit to Uncle Hanny. He gave a talk 5 years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday. He gave a talk at my church 5 years ago, and he said, this is what your priorities should be. And I'm like, oh, boy, I took my phone out real quick. I said, I've never heard this before, so I got to write it down. You probably have heard it, but I haven't, okay? So these are the 5 priorities as prescribed by Uncle Hanny, and I agree 100%. I'm sure Uncle Samir, you probably agree also with this list.
I can see.
You can see. So number 1 is your spiritual life. That is number 1 priority, okay? Your time with Christ. Number 2 is your family responsibilities. Number 3, your job or education and or education. Number 4, your service in church. And number 5, your hobbies. Wow, I can tell you, since he gave that talk, no joke, it was 2011, so I'm lying, not 5, 4 years. 2011, he gave this talk. I wrote it down, and anytime I'm feeling lost, like my priorities are so out of whack, I take my phone out, I pull up Uncle Handy's lecture, and I go, wow, it really helps you realign, okay? So know your priorities and help them to fill out the grid I just showed you.
Is that something personal? Yeah, that's something depends on who you are, or maybe, I don't know. If that's biblical, let me ask this question. That's
When
how
Uncle
the
Haney,
Bible put it?
yeah, when Uncle Haney gave the lecture, he didn't say that it was biblical, but he said that this was his recommended go-to list of priorities.
I think it depends not who you are, but whose you are. Got it?
I don't think there'll be too much variation in the list between individuals. Like, you're not going to put any one of these things before number 1, I would hope. Right? That's kind of the whole point of the lecture. And then point number 4, this one's just my little thing, right? So I have all these little nicks and knacks and tricks for when I feel like I'm getting lost in priorities and I'm feeling like I'm getting lost in busyness. Have a safe place, okay? Like, have a place where you can go and it's your own mini retreat. And it doesn't have to be far. It literally can be very close. I live in Long Island, so I'm going to show you a picture of my, this is Ocean Parkway in Jones Beach. If any of you have ever been there, this is my safe place. and I only like to go at nighttime. So if you guys are ever around, feel free to say hi to me, right? I'll be there. But like it's only 20 minutes from my house. If I feel like so lost and I want to get away and I want to pray and I want to be secluded, this is where I go. It's also where serial killers go. Really weird story, but that's totally separate. So have a safe place. Okay, that's my point. Have a safe place where you can go and pray and feel like you're getting away from everything for a little while. Finally, I want to end with one thing that Father Anthony from DC, he said this once, and it really struck me really nicely. He said, "We are meant to take refuge from action in spiritual things. But instead, we often take refuge from spiritual things in action." We've reversed the way that our lives are supposed to work. So I hope I did a good job convincing you of being busy is a bad thing, and how to conquer it, and what the consequences are. Does anyone have any questions?
Can you just quickly elaborate on the last point? I don't think I got it.
The last point?
The last thing you just said, when Anthony was talking.
Yeah, sorry. I have to read it again. He said, "We are meant to take refuge from actions in spiritual things, but instead, now you got it. But instead, we take refuge from spiritual things in actions." So we've
Switch things.
what other questions?
How do you make sure that when you're in service, that you're doing it for His glory and not for your own? Like, how do you, I guess, keep yourself humble when like other people are like, say, "Oh, like great job on doing this," and you try to like, how do you do it in a way that's not like, "Yes, thank you so much," or like, how do you like give Him the glory? Like, what? I mean, besides saying, "Oh, like thank God I can do," like what do you do?
Uncle Samir. I can't talk about this.
Guys, what do you think? How do you know if what you're doing is you're doing it for the glory of God, right? That's the question. Not for your self glorification. So, that's the question.
That wasn't your question.
No, it was more like how do you
Evaluate.
what?
How do you evaluate?
Yeah, and also like how do you give Him the glory? Also, like when people glorify you, like how do you sort of bring it back to Him?
I think it's an attitude.
Okay.
It's an attitude inside of you.
The Bible has a verse where Jesus said that whoever speaks from himself, he asks the glory of himself. Whoever speaks from God asks the glory of God. It's a verse in the Bible. So check yourself out.
I think the best advice I was given in terms of how to go about service and how to go about not giving yourself the glory, the examples I was always given was, the more you love the person, the more you're gonna realize what they do for you. Is it for example, when my mom used to help me with my homework or something, and like I get a good grade, be like, "Oh, it was all me." I wouldn't say that. I would be like, "Okay, my mom helped me with this. Like it wasn't me. I didn't do this project by myself. My mom was the one who helped me with it." And it was just something that came naturally. So I feel like the closer you do get to God, the more you realize what He does in your life, the more you're gonna start to notice, okay, like I didn't do this on my own. There's no way I could have done it.
Mike.
In Philippians 1, St. Paul talks about how some were preaching the word of Christ out of envy, and others were preaching it out of like wholeheartedly. So I think it's important to also realize to put an emphasis that no matter the motivation, Christ's work is being done, but also so it's secondary, really. It shouldn't be your primary concern that why you're doing it. And then secondarily, it should be, okay, I think it comes through the thoughts. If you let your thoughts just keep thinking, keep going, oh, I'm the man, I'm doing this, then, you got, just cut it off from the beginning.
Right.
And that's your first step,
It's an inner thing. It's you evaluate yourself.
I heard once, this is a business principle, but it can be applied here, that the business principle is if you have a program, you create a program, for example, and the program cannot sustain itself without you, and you haven't done a good job of creating that program. It's the same thing, I think, my humble opinion, it's service. If you are involved in a service and you can't envision that service, or you know that that service won't succeed without you, you've created a problem. And you've brought glory only to yourself. So that service should continue without you. I mean, we're vessels, but we're not the water. So if we become the water, there's a big issue.
One of the big mistakes that we do in our life usually is the idea of service and our spiritual relationship with God. And I think that's very clear with Martha and Mary. Many times, because we emphasize service very much in this church and in all churches, we focus on the service. So I'm going the Sunday drive, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Like in my personal relationship is حاجة تانية خالص, completely different direction. Like I'm serving. I'm serving because it's nice to be with people and it's nice to feel good that you fed the homeless and you did that. But it's very dangerous that the emphasis in the service without having the relationship with God. Because that becomes a social work. Social work will do that. The social work will help people. But because that's what they do. Like when we serve, the service is a result of our relationship with Christ. And if we don't have this relationship with Christ, the service is going to be social work.
Can I inject with commercial here? That's why we're having a prayer night tonight. And that's why we're having tomorrow night also. In the evening, prayer night. With the beginning of the month of Kiyat. We try to lift up our spirits, and a relationship with God does not come but through prayer. So if you do not spend time with God in prayer, don't think you have a relationship with God. Okay? St. John Chrysostom said something very interesting. He said, he who does not pray is dead. Meaning that he's not in a relationship with God. Prayer meaning you're in touch with God. Talking to God all the time. So if you're not doing this, don't kill yourself. It's not because we are in the church. The Martha situation is very interesting. And it's a good lesson for all of us. The time you sit at the feet of Christ is the most precious time that will help you to do anything else successful. That's conversion rate.
I have a question, everyone. Last question. Can I be serving God's house, not that God of the house? Can I be serving in the church, busy here and there, in the church, in the house of God, while I'm not serving the Lord or the God of the house? And this is how the devil is making me convinced that I'm on the right track, while I think I'm not.
That's I think the talk on against question.
What other questions? No? Okay. Oh, yep.
I don't really have a question.
Comments. It's fine.
I guess it's kind of a question, but not really.
Yes.
I feel like there's a slight fine line in the idea of busyness, in a sense that the way things are nowadays, when let's say you're one person, you're responsible for certain things. You need to be busy enough to live. You know what I mean? Like, there's definitely overworking, but you still have to work enough to maintain a roof over your head and to at least have some food in your stomach. Maybe you won't be full, but so sometimes the people that don't really make enough do overwork, but it's only truly to keep a roof over their head. So
Yeah, I know.
Do you know what I'm
That's
saying?
a very, very good point. I want to tell a story in response to that. There was once I don't know if it's a true story or not, a story I heard. College professor in front of the classroom, He brought maybe you've heard the story before. He brought a big jar, and it was full of huge rocks. Okay? And he said to the class, it was full of huge rocks. And he said to the class, is the jar full? And the class said, yes, the jar's full. Clearly, it's to the top with rocks, big rocks. So he got some gravel, and he poured the gravel in, and it went all around the rocks. And he said, is the jar full? Now, the class realized, wait a minute, he's going somewhere with this. So the class said, no, the jar's still not full. Okay, so then he got some sand. He poured the sand, and the sand went in between the gravel and went in between the rocks. And it looks really full. And he says to the class, is the jar full? And the class still says, wisely, they say, no, the jar's not full. And then he says, okay, good point. So he goes and gets water. And he pours the water, and the water fills in between all the cracks, and now the jar is really full. And so there's nothing else he could do now. So he says to the class, what's the point of the story? And someone in the back of the class raises his hand and says, no matter how much you do in life, you always have time for more. You can always squeeze in the gravel, the sand, and the water. And da. He says, no, that's not the story. The story is you have to start with the rocks. You don't start with the rocks. You pour the gravel, you pour the sand, you pour the water, and you have no room for the rocks. The point is, I think the definition of busyness, though it may appear easily digestible by saying I am busy 24 hours a day, not only is that one of the definitions, but the other definition is, do we start our time, do we give our most important time, most valuable time, the first fruit of our time, does it go to Christ? Does it go to the relationship with Christ first or not? Because otherwise, we're pouring the gravel, we're pouring the sand, and we're expecting to fit these big rocks afterwards. So your point is well taken, but I also think that it's also a construction of our time.
Yeah, well, the people that are busy work, they think they're doing what they can to barely make ends meet. Sometimes you don't know when enough is enough.
But
So
there is
that
always
point kind of happens.
there is always time.
Right, but that's what he's saying.
For-
The bigger rocks I'm mentalizing as the more important ones. Right.
Mhm.
So it kind of puts
Yeah.
everything in a category.
Jesus is a rock who will make you rocky. Somebody. Have him there.
Thank you, Chris.
Glory be to God for
Thank you.